Chapter 17. How the Fight Against the Slave Trade Began. Until the end of the 18th century, few people in England or anywhere else gave much thought to the slaves in the West Indies. But even as early as the 17th century, members of the religious Society of Friends, called Quakers, had spoken against slavery. George Fox, the founder of the society, urged the Friends in Barbados to treat their slaves well and finally to set them free. Quakers in America and in England declared slave trading and slave owning to be equally wrong, and members of the society were forbidden to have any dealings with the slave trade or to keep slaves. But the first successful attack on slavery was made by Granville Sharp, the son of an English clergyman. As he was the 12th of a family of 14, he could not be sent to college to study for a profession. Instead, he was sent to London, where he became a clerk in government office. Granville had two older brothers in London, William and James. William was a doctor. One day, Granville was leaving his brother's surgery when he noticed a Negro waiting with other poor patients for free treatment. The man seemed to be in a very sad state, and Granville turned back to ask his brother about him. The man told him that his name was Jonathan Strong. He was a slave belonging to Mr. David Lyle, a lawyer from Barbados. His cruel master had flogged him so savagely that he could hardly stand, and had then beaten him on the head with a pistol till he was nearly blind. Finally, he had turned him into the street. The brothers did what they could for the poor man. They took him to a London hospital, and when he left it 4 months later, they got him a job as an errand boy at a chemist's shop. 2 years later, Lyle saw his former slave in the street, followed him to the chemist's shop, and finding the man was again able to work, he sold him for 30 sterling to a man named Kerr, a Jamaican planter. Kerr had Strong kidnapped and put in prison to await the next ship sailing to the West Indies. But the poor man managed to send an appeal for help to Granville Sharp. Granville's brother James was a person of some importance in the city, and he appealed to the Lord Mayor. Strong was set free. Lyle and Kerr then claimed 200 sterling for damages from Granville Sharp, but in the end they gave up their claim. This affair made Granville Sharp study the question, is slavery lawful in England? He studied old laws and acts of Parliament and became sure that it was not lawful, but he wanted one of the king's judges to declare this beyond all doubt. During the next few years, Sharp worked hard for this purpose. Then came the Somerset case. A Virginian planter had brought a slave named Somerset to London. After running away from his owner, Somerset was recaptured and shipped for sale in Jamaica. Could a man be by law a slave in England? Sharp employed lawyers to take the case to the king's judges, and at last the chief judge declared that as soon as a slave set foot in England, he was a free man. From that time, 1772, all the slaves who had gone with their masters to England, about 14,000, were free men, whether they remained in their former master's service or not. The Somerset case was the beginning of the end of slavery in the British Commonwealth. It was Granville Sharp who had aroused interest in slaves and started the fight that ended in the emancipation or freeing of the slaves 60 years later. 13 years after the Somerset case, one of the professors at Cambridge University set his students a holiday task for which he offered a prize. The task was a Latin essay on the subject, "Is it right to make slaves of men against their will?" One of the students, Thomas Clarkson, set to work on the essay. He read books written by American Quakers on the question of slavery. By the time the essay was finished, he had not only made up his mind that it was wrong to make men slaves, but also that he would make it his life work to fight against slavery, instead of becoming a clergyman as he had intended. Clarkson's essay won the prize. He rewrote it in English, and it was published as a little book which was widely read. Then, with the help of Granville Sharp and some Quakers, Clarkson started his fight for the slaves. The Quakers had set up a committee to collect and publish facts about slavery that would arouse the interest of the people in England and win their sympathy for the slaves. In the autumn of 1787, Clarkson set out on the first of his many journeys to search for facts. He visited Bristol and Liverpool, the two English ports chiefly engaged in the slave trade. He boarded slave ships and measured the slave quarters. He obtained specimens of shackles, thumbscrews, mouth openers, and other disgusting instruments of torture. At first, Clarkson was regarded as a harmless busybody, and no one took much notice of him and his questions. But when he began to uncover some of the dark deeds done on slave ships, the traders became less friendly. At Liverpool, he was followed and molested. Once, some roughs employed by the traders nearly succeeded in pushing him off a pierhead into a high sea. But Clarkson was not easily frightened. He went on with his work and later returned to London with deadly evidence regarding the slave trade, in which at that time about 130 English ships were engaged. In 1 year, 1787, these ships had carried no less than 42,000 slaves. Clarkson next set out on lecturing tours, traveling up and down the country, holding meetings, and telling men and women the truth about the slave trade. This work was necessary and useful, but it was not enough. If trading in slaves was to be brought to an end, and that was the first step in the struggle for freedom, it was necessary to get someone in the House of Commons itself to fight for the slaves. Petitions had been sent to Parliament by the Quakers, but these had been given little attention. A man was needed who would speak in the House of Commons in such a way that the members would listen. Who could do this? In the next chapter, we shall read of the man who did it. His name was William Wilberforce.